Welcome everybody to our June edition of the CSSSA webinar. Just a couple rules of the road before I forget. Please keep yourself on mute, and you're welcome to keep your video on if you want, but it will increase the bandwidth. We haven't had issues in the past with that happening, but you never know. I'm certainly going to turn my video off so I can relax and enjoy Cale's talk. Also, if you would like to ask questions, please put them in the chat. I will be monitoring the chat, and I'll interrupt Cale if there's a particular point of clarification. Something's not clear on his slides. Otherwise, at the end, we'll do a more thorough Q&A where he'll just really, we'll grill him as hard as we can. So today we're going to be hearing, and I'm going to have to read this because I couldn't possibly do justice to it off the top of my head. Generating Policy Insight, a computational social science approach to policy analysis. And our speaker is our very own Cale Reeves. He is I'm going to get this wrong, let me just make sure, visiting assistant professor at the Georgia Institute of Technology School for Public Policy. He is interested in, obviously, public policy, but especially the application of computational social science methods to public policy, and how agent-based modeling can be used to elicit the dynamics of systems where there's individual decision-making, and that gives rise to macroscopic patterns such as green energy adoption and that sort of thing. Yeah, so without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Cale. And Cale, if I've missed a specific point in your background or research interest, please feel free to fill in the gaps. I didn't want to take up too much time from you. So
a solid high level. I'll start from there and go.
All right, great. Thank you very much, and it is over to you.
Thanks, folks. Thanks for coming. It's a pleasure to be here and to share some of this work with you and some of this sort of approach and way of thinking about things. So I come to computational social science from policy. I'm policy all the way down, and some of these tools jumped out at me several years ago as just really fantastic ways to approach policy analysis and to think about how we can figure out what's going on in policy. So I'm going to sort of proceed from the assumption that not everybody here is a dyed-in-the-wool computer scientist. And so we'll start at a kind of a lower level and build up some ideas and then sort of think about how things fit together. First, acknowledgements. This is a summary of a lot of work, and it would be remiss to ignore the contributions of several other people, one of whom I believe is here today. And then this is a high-level overview, all right? We're going to start, this is the UI here. We're going to start by talking about some diffusion modeling. We're going to get into energy technology adoption. We're going to go down a rabbit hole for a particular model and a particular approach. And then we're going to dig our way back out of that rabbit hole with hopefully exciting policy insights. Before we get to Q&A. Once we get to Q&A, we've landed. You know that everything's easy for you after that. It just gets hard for me. I want to start with this quote, Russell Ackoff. As a verb, to model means to demonstrate, to reveal, and to show what a thing is like. I really like that idea of showing what a thing is like, because a lot of things can be like a lot of other things. And really, it's that metaphor that I think that we're using when we try and make some policy insight by modeling the system. The system that I'm going to talk a lot about today is diffusion, specifically the diffusion of residential solar PV, how it happens that first there's one and then there's more. And I think that we can sort of think about looking at diffusion in this way, this really simple idea, right? The red is spreading throughout the gray, this diffusion phenomenon, right? And we can look at this cumulative diffusion curve over time, and that's a sort of a tracking of the process here, right? Of the progress of red spreading through gray. So we can look at that and we can think, well, what is this system like? And this is kind of the jumping off point for modeling, right? We can think that that system is like a sigmoid curve. And we can think about modeling it by a kind of a simple curve fitting exercise. Come up with a couple of parameters. If this is where the system is when we start to model it, we come up with basically a BAS model, a new product diffusion model. You come up with a really sort of simple idea of what you should expect. Now, there's some problems. Clearly, you have under predicted the total market size, but this does give you some insight, right? This is a sort of a classically top-down predictive model. And the policy insight here is sort of managerial in nature, right? You have some idea of what to expect in the near term. That doesn't allow you to do too much, apart from, I don't know, change your inventory ordering practices or something. So we want to get a little deeper. So we can now think about, okay, what else is this system like? As the red diffuses, the squares are either red or gray. That sounds like a classification model. It sounds like a classification process. We can model that with a logistic regression, where whether y is red or gray is dependent on the number of neighbors, x1. We have a very simple idea that as x1 increases, the square in question is more likely to be red. Great. Now we've got a sort of a top-down explanatory model, and that has a sort of a different policy insight to it, right? The policy insight here is manipulative in nature, right? You have some idea of, if I could just change the number of neighbors that are red, I can make folks go red. But is it a lever you can pull? It's kind of difficult and pricey, for example, in residential solar PV to just say, hey, I'm going to get this house to adopt solar PV by putting solar PV on all the houses around it. It's a very expensive process, right? So maybe it's not a lever you can pull. So we can dig a little deeper, go a little differently, and think about the individual decision to adopt redness in this case, right? The individual decision to become red. And we can model that decision-making directly through a simple rule. It happens to be this rule. I happen to know it's correct because that's actually what makes this. And it gives us a different kind of insight, right? Now we're looking at the decision-making process. We've modeled the decision-making directly using rules, right? And that's kind of the process that I think about when I think about how to get some policy insight. I got to have decision makers that are behaving in some reasonable way. They're making decisions using rules in a context, right? Here we have this square, which has unknown color. And how does that square decide to be red? Well, it makes decision in the context of the redness that surrounds it. That explains the whole system generatively. And from that, these macro level characteristics emerge. And that sort of framework, that progression of context, decision-making, and outcome is I think, the piece that I latch onto from a policy perspective. Right? And in this case, that policy insight is manipulative in nature, right? We can think of a policy that impacts the context in which the decision to become red is made. And that's what we're looking for, right? When policy changes the context. In the case of residential solar PV, policy is pretty active. We have rebates, for example, that change the economic context in which a decision is made. We have informational programs that can change the informational context as well. And from there, we find ourselves with this idea that and this is cartoonish, but I think it's fun. And we also get to talk about bowling, which is that in the context of bowling, bowlers make decisions, right? They can make the decision to, this is how one hooks, where the ball goes, and then strike, right? This bowler makes a decision in the context of bowling that hopefully generates very nice outcomes, right? A whole bunch of strikes, and they get to win a trophy. And here's the trick. Here's the trick. Policy impacts this, right? Because this bowler doesn't have to make decisions of such high quality in order to generate good outcomes, right? Because with policy, we can sort of make the worst decision-making outcomes less likely to occur, right? This is bumper bowling. This is the level at which I bowl. Okay, so now let's describe the context of the solar PV adoption and diffusion system, all right? So we know money's a player. Residential solar PV is expensive. Even with rebates, it's still an expensive thing. So money's going to be a big player. And when there's money, there's rebates, right? And these rebates contribute to the ability for folks to put solar PV on their roof. They get it installed. That then generates some technological benefits, right? These are learning benefits. We see, especially in balance of systems, that the more installations that happen, the more folks get good at installing. And that in turn, this is just another generic techno picture, that in turn feeds back into the system and decreases prices. So we know that this is a feature, that it's expensive, but the price is going down as installation progresses. We know also that advocacy is a player here. We know that folks have informational barriers to adoption. We know that they overcome these informational barriers by interacting with their neighbors, right? There are strong social determinants of residential solar PV adoption that come from the interactions with folks' neighbors. Things like, somebody's interested, so they go for a walk in their neighborhood. They see that their neighbor has residential solar PV, and they say, "Hey, what was that like?" That then feeds back into adoption, and this informational loop continues to increase the diffusion rates by permeating the system with information. Hopefully then all of this together generates some positive outcomes, right? So we can avoid this smog land future. That's kind of the system in pictures. We can sort of formalize that with a relationship like this, where rebates going up means prices go down, adoption goes up, learning goes up, costs go down, and prices go down. So we have an economic subsystem that is sort of reinforcing. And then on the informational side, we know that advocacy increases norms. As norms increase, adoption increases, and increasing adoption increases norms as well. So there's an informational subsystem as well. Together, all of these result in adoptions that generate benefits. We can focus in then on the core of the system, which is kind of this relationship between levers. We have rebates, common policy lever, impacts prices, impacts adoption. Also norms that impact adoption, right? So this adoption decision then is really directly driven by two features, some aspect of economic context and some aspect of socially informed attitude, informational context. We then operationalize this decision-making to adopt in an empirical setting. Basically, the empirical rule, the very simple rule that we're going to operationalize in this empirical setting is that in order to adopt, folks have to be able to afford it, right? They have to be sufficiently activated in the economic subsystem, and they have to think it's a good idea. So they have to be sufficiently activated in the informational subsystem. When those two come together, they can afford it and they want to, they adopt. We're going to operationalize that with an empirically grounded agent-based model, where the agents are actual single-family households, 173,466 single-family households in Austin, Texas. And these individual single-family households have numerous data streams that describe their access to economic resources and their access to informational resources, right? We bring in data from tax assessor. We have surveys which we fielded, which we use to gauge the distribution of informational resources in the system. they make these agents exist in an environment, which is also described by numerous data streams, right? The environment includes things like installation prices, which help to set the economic context in which agents make decisions. Rebates and tariffs, which together are sort of the policy context, which also impacts the economic context. And then the small world networks in which these agents are situated contribute to their ability to exchange information with one another, right? The social ties, the flows of information from agent to agent in the system are described in this way. And then finally, there are rules. The rules that we just talked about, actually. The agents must be economically and informationally activated in order to choose to adopt. This model sort of generates these patterns, right? The question is, does this model work? Does this model capture some aspect of the emergent macro level characteristics of the system built off of these rules, of these agents operationalized in an empirical context? And the answer is, yeah, it works kind of well. So what you're seeing here in the yellow, if you can see this one here is yellow. That's the empirical cumulative adoption curve, which goes up. And in the purple, focus on that line, which is sort of buried at times somewhere here. The purple line that you see here includes both the economic and informational contexts. And you can see that the purple line does the best job of capturing this idiosyncratic feature in the yellow line. The purple line does the best job of capturing features in the cumulative adoption curve of time. Now, this is a good sign, right? This means that when there's something going on, the purple line is able to pick up on it, right? So in some sense, by including both the economic and informational context, this modeling approach is capturing the empirical reality. Not only is it capturing something about cumulative adoption over time, but it's also capturing something about the geospatial distribution of adoption, right? Here we have the empirical density of adoption. Notice there's hotspots. And the base case, which is the purple one, does a fairly decent job of capturing these hotspots. That said, there are places where it overestimates adoption in the hotspots and underestimates adoption in some other places. Generally works better than the economic only model, right? So by including these informational flows, we're adding something of value over a simple economic model of decision making, right? Generally speaking, this modeling approach has relatively low error and relatively high spatial accuracy. All of this to say that it does a pretty good job of capturing the macro level system behavior. And that is kind of down into the rabbit hole of this particular model. We're going to start to dig our way out now. So what can we do with this kind of model? This is where we get to the policy part. What can we do with it? Well, we can take it for a run. The first question that I want to ask is, okay, so suppose we have these adoptions which occur in the context of a policy. Were they accelerated adoptions or were they additional adoptions? Should I think of this as being market expansion? Or should I think of this as just folks who reached their reservation price a little bit earlier because of a rebate, right? So what we're going to say is that when the last touch, the last piece of that sort of two-part decision making was an economic spark, then we'll say that it was an accelerated adoption, which means that the agent was already informationally activated. They became economically activated. And that basically says that they were already in the market and they reached their reservation price. As opposed to an agent whose last touch was an informational spark, right? What this says is that an agent could already afford it. They already thought they already had the access to economic resources to adopt residential solar PV. What happened was they realized they wanted it. This we'll think of as an additional adoption. This is market expansion. The agent was not in the market for solar. They could afford it, they just didn't want it. And we can think about tracking which of these aspects of the decision was the last touch, or which sparked the actual adoption over time in the context and out of the context of the relevant policy. So what you're seeing here is a model of Fit to San Jose, where they had the California Solar Initiative. This is a policy that delivered huge rebates over time. And what we've done here is we have modeled in blue the factual scenario in which the policy was enacted. All right, we have fit the model to that, and then we've stripped out the policy such that we have this simulated counterfactual in sort of pinkish salmon color, in which there was no CSI policy active. The model fits reasonably well to the factual scenario, which is a good sign. And in the counterfactual scenario, with the policy stripped out, there's no CSI rebates, and there are fewer adoptions, right? That's not surprising, right? The whole point of the rebate was to make more adoptions. The rebate made more adoptions. We stripped out the rebate, we have fewer adoptions, but what kinds of adoptions? Well, we can see here that there are 471 of the 1,265 economic spark events that happen in the factual model do not happen in the counterfactual model. So 471 of those roughly 700 fewer adoptions don't happen. So this policy then appears to have about 2/3 of its additional adoptions that are this accelerated adoptions which would have happened later, but the economic spark event happened earlier. On the other hand, about 290 of 588 informational spark events that happen in the factual don't happen in the counterfactual. This suggests that the impact of the policy was about 1/3 additional adoptions, market expansion through the informational subsystem in the adoption diffusion sort of idea. This is important because these have different sort of benefits, right? A accelerated adoption basically displaces emissions slightly earlier than it would have been otherwise. That is a different value than displaced emissions that you should not have otherwise expected, which is these additional adoptions. These are more valuable than the others. So this is an explanation, this is a illustration of a policy insight that has sort of evaluation at its core, right? This is some ex post analysis of a policy which was enacted that gives us sort of deeper insight than a top level analysis does, right? Sort of deeper than just 761 avoided adoptions, deeper into that in the sense that we now have some idea of how those additional adoptions came about. So keeping on this idea of informational barriers and economic barriers to adoption of which spark event happens and which spark event doesn't happen, we can take a look over time at the prevalence of each of these gaps, right? Here you're seeing in blue actual adoptions, and in green economic barriers, right? So in green we're having, these are folks who are informationally activated but not economically activated. The barrier they face is economic in nature. And then in red, folks who are economically activated but not informationally activated. The barrier those folks face to adoption is informational in nature. And we can start to think about how would we implement a program designed to deliver these folks who can afford it information necessary to drive their adoption decision. And to think about that, I've used these four sort of archetypes of informational intervention programs, four sort of ways to deliver information into a system. This one I'll call the celebrity advocate. This is where information comes from somebody outside the system, somewhere outside the system, and has the ability to impact everyone inside the system, right? This is mass market advertising. This is a celebrity advocate. This is something which, you know, by TV or radio has the ability to just reach a whole bunch of people. We'll compare that to an idea over here, a phone ambassador. This is somebody in the system. This is modeled after a program in Solarize, Oregon. This is somebody in the system who is willing to share their experience with folks who are considering adopting. All right. So basically, this works in a completely different way. This is actually building new ties between folks who are trusted sources of information and folks who are interested in accessing more information. There are two other ones that we're not going to talk too much about in this presentation. Porch talks were modeled after a thing that they did in the Mueller neighborhood in Austin, Texas, where folks had a sort of a geographic limit to their information sharing. And then community champions, which are basically people who are in the system. You provide them with a little more information and you tell them to go tell everyone they already know, basically. So let's dig a little deeper into celebrity advocates and phone ambassadors as archetypical ways to deliver information into a system. What you're looking at here are additional adoptions in the heat map, where this sort of whitish yellowy color is a lot, and this slightly colder red color is fewer additional adoptions. On the y-axis, you have the effectiveness of an informational seed. This is the ability of a informational seed, whether it's a celebrity advocate or a phone ambassador, to engage with the people that they could potentially engage with. This is something that you don't have control over as a program designer, as a implementation. You don't have control over this as you implement the program. On the other hand, the x-axis is something you do have control over. This is the number of additional informational seeds, right? In the case of the celebrity advocate, this would be how many celebrities did I hire, right? So probably you're not going to hire 100 celebrities. You'll probably be somewhere down here in this range. Conversely, for the phone ambassador, you might think of hiring 100 or so, which I jumped the gun a little bit, but we'll talk about that shortly. And notice the pattern here. As expected, you hire more celebrities, you find yourself in this much hotter region of additional adoptions. As very few celebrities become more effective at engaging their followers, you find yourself in this hotter region of additional adoption. Not too surprising in the case of a celebrity advocate. But in the case of the phone ambassador, it's very interesting that it's not extremely sensitive to the number of additional phone ambassadors that you recruit to be a part of your program, right? From 50 to 100, you find yourself still in this region, which is potentially pretty effective as they can become better at engaging their followers. That's pretty interesting. And it suggests then that the phone ambassador technique, the phone ambassador as an archetype of a way to introduce information into a system could be pretty effective. We can add an idea to that, which is to say that the mechanism by which the celebrity advocate works. This is Matthew McConaughey standing in front of some solar panels. I think the picture is actually taken in Australia, so sorry about that. But we have Matthew McConaughey standing in front of solar panels, and the picture just looks expensive, right? Celebrity advocates as a brute force approach to providing information in a system in such a way that reinforcement is capable, that agents are able to access multiple sources of positive information. It's expensive, right? But you might think about a phone ambassador, which works instead of a brute force approach, works by restructuring the underlying network, by adding new connections as a relatively inexpensive approach to introducing information into the system, right? I don't know how many millions of dollars or hundreds of thousands of dollars Matthew McConaughey requires to advocate for solar panels, but I'm guessing that you can get people who are already installers who are interested in sharing on board to communicate their experience for less. So we can think about that as being an attractive way to introduce information into the system. And this sort of policy insight speaks to the policy design and program implementation side. So not just evaluation, right? Now we're on the front end of things. Now we're doing some ex ante analyses. But I want to go back to the back end of things, to the evaluation sort of side of things, the ex post idea. Well, really, we're going to mix ex ante and ex post and talk about outcomes, right? We talked about cumulative adoption, but that's not where the story ends, in part because we have access to so much more information about the decision making. This slide, I didn't. Okay, well, it's a little more busy than I remember. But basically, the idea here is that we have talked several times about cumulative adoption curves. And since we know so much more about our agents than they are just a thing which either does or does not have residential solar PV or the characteristic in question, we can think about equity, right? We can think about inequality. So here you have a sort of a pseudo Gini index, which shows the prevalence of solar installations over wealth, and the baseline home value Gini coefficient is 0.40 in Austin, Texas. Solar PV is distributed slightly less equitably than that, which is to say that at lower values of wealth, folks have fewer solar, and then up here, the highest values of wealth tend to have more than the baseline equity distribution of home values. And so this is the problem that exists in Austin, and it's even more of a problem than just an equity problem, because the lower and middle income earning agents are not only exposed to fuel and carbon cost fluctuations because they don't have as much residential solar PV, but the cost recovery methods are pretty regressive, which is to say that they are paying for essentially to subsidize the access to the grid for wealthier folks, right? On the other hand, not only do wealthy folks have protection from these carbon cost fluctuations, but they are also getting some generation income when they size their systems. In Austin, Texas, by 518, nearly 7 kilowatts per system. This is basically a very large solar PV system that the wealthier folks can afford to have, that then not only does it offset their bill, gives them generation income. So in the context of this sort of burgeoning equity question, Austin Energy has adjusted the structure of its rebates. All right, May 1st, 2018, they went from this sort of per unit where the rebate started at $2 per watt, decrease over time, wound up at 40 cents per watt, to a flat rate for an installation that was meeting certain criteria for size. $2,500 per installation. Over the summer, they ran a special. They added $1,000 to that. And the idea is, will this change in rebate structure have an impact on equity? And okay, yeah, put another way, what should they expect for distributional impacts? And so you can model this using this sort of approach that we discussed, and you can see that what happens between quarter 40 and quarter 72 in terms of the cumulative adoption of solar PV is an improvement in the Gini coefficient, right? Which is to say that after this change in rebate level, adoptions themselves become more equitably distributed. Conversely, the cumulative installed capacity almost doesn't change, which is to say the interpretation of both of these figures together is to say that more lower income folks are installing systems, but they're not installing extremely large systems. This is good. This is a positive change in equity. However, the other thing to come out here is the lowest 25% of home values, of the distribution of home values, are still less equitably distributed solar PV installations are still less equity distributed than the baseline distribution of home values, right? Which leads us to another bit of a policy insight here, which is to say that just changing the rebate structure is not going to help those who are worst off. You should not expect a change in the lowest regions of wealth distribution, right? So as far as policy insights go, this is an approach to thinking about heterogeneous impacts, which is kind of a hot topic in policy research, right? And we have some unique access to the conversation around heterogeneous impacts when we have fully resolved agents who have characteristics like wealth. We can take these heterogeneous impacts idea and go a little further. And this is something that we explored in the context of COVID, of the spread of COVID-19. We started modeling the social spread of COVID-19, the idea being that we have some idea how folks get together to exchange information. We can adapt that to think about how folks get together and exchange viral particles, which are, interestingly enough, also information. So we modeled the spread of COVID over time, and we see with a shelter-in-place order, we have this uptick followed by a downtick that we can attribute to this change in policy. That's very good. Because the agents are fully resolved, we can break out that cumulative curve by ages, right? We know the ages of the people in this model. These are heads of household. And, you know, there are this distribution of 18 to 49, 49 to 59, I believe. I'm sorry, 50 to 64 and 65 plus. Unfortunately, the thing looks a little low resolution there. You may not be able to see that. Apologies. We can break this idea out. And what we can do is compare the distribution of hospitalization in the system at a particular time to the baseline prevalence of folks in that age group, right? What you can see then is that there are times when, for example, the 50 to 64-year-olds are experiencing more than, I don't know if you can see the dotted line there, right about there. They're experiencing more than their baseline prevalence in the system in cumulative hospitalization, right? That group is over experiencing hospitalization. The relationship between hospitalization to age in the COVID model comes from an input, though. It actually comes from the way the epidemiologists are modeling this phenomenon with this SE and then radically expanded I space R model. And these are age-dependent progressions, right? So folks who are, for example, here's one. Folks who are infected and symptomatic have an age-dependent probability of moving to hospitalization or to recovery. And so really that relationship to age is baked into the model. But what's not baked into the model are, I think we talked about, yeah, SEIR, great. And that relationship there. What's not baked into the model, though, are the relationships between hospitalization and income, for example. Instead, this comes from the joint distributions of income and agent age and occupation class, which is then impacted by the particular shelter-in-place order that is instituted, right? So this isn't baked in. Age was baked in. This is not. And what you see here is during the shelter-in-place order, some folks experience greater than proportional distribution of total hospitalization, and they're the lowest income earners in the system. So here we have some idea of looking at the distributional impacts over time by income, which is emergent, not baked into the system. And the interesting insight that comes from this is an idea that a earlier shelter-in-place order might avoid some of the hospitalization, right? It really might cut down a lot on the total amount of hospitalization in the system. But that hospitalization will probably be disproportionately borne by the lowest income earners. All right. This suggests that yes, early shelter-in-place orders are good, but you've got to have additional policies to support those who are most vulnerable in the system in order to achieve anything like an equitable outcome. And so the policy inside here depends on these heterogeneous pathways to heterogeneous impact, right? So we have different folks who experience the phenomena differently, but they experience it because of the way they progress through that epidemiological SEIR model, right? There are different pathways to hospitalization or non-hospitalization. We can take that idea that we built originally in COVID-19 and bring it back into technology co-adoption, right? This is where we go back to Russell Ackoff a bit and we ask, how is home energy technology adoption like COVID-19? And to do that, we're going to take this idea of a compartmental model, which has these ideas of path dependence, which we know occur in technology adoption, and make informational or agent state dependent progressions through the adoption process. And use this to analyze the composition, sequence, and timing of entire suites of home energy technologies, right? So not just solar PV, but solar PV, smart thermostats, DER enrollment that goes along with the smart thermostat, HVAC updates that are high efficiency. And using something very similar to that compartmental model, these are some very early results that show, for example, an agent that adopts a smart thermostat then has a probability of adopting HVAC relatively soon, or solar slightly later after they adopt solar, then HVAC. Basically, the idea is that we can now think about using that insight from the social spread of COVID-19 to model pathways through the home energy adoption landscape, where the idea is that agents start off susceptible, they don't have any technologies, and then they adopt sequentially smart thermostats or HVAC or solar PV in green. And then they exit the system or recover. Really, we're just applying an analog of the SEIR model to various, you can think of these as being different infection states. And the potential for policy insight from this idea is that we can now use policy by adjusting information and adjusting the economic context. We can use policy to change the context so that we can encourage a preferred pathway to a desirable outcome, which would be, accelerated installations of entire suites of energy efficient technologies. My mouth is very dry. I will have a sip of water shortly, but I think this is the big ender. All right. These exciting policy insights that depend on the policy leading to the context and modeling the decision making, such that you can look at an outcome, or the policy and the context and the decision making leading to an outcome that you focus your attention on, or the policy and the context into sequential decisions and outcomes, all yield these sorts of different ideas about what's going on in the policy system. They all yield different sort of insights that themselves exist both in the design and implementation stage and in the evaluation stage. And that's where I have my sip of water.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating as always. I especially like the sequential decision-making part and analyzing the trajectories of agents through a space. So I'm gonna jump the queue here. How do you analyze that sort of thing? Because that's non-trivial.
So what I've done, and keeping in mind, this is very new work. So the first approach that I'm taking is by thinking of these different sort of pathways as different species of infection, right? So agents might find themselves infected with solar, then smart thermostat, then HVAC, right? And that sequence might have associated timings with, well, it does in the way of modeling now. Or somebody might, once they get bitten by the home energy technology bug, right, they might catch the solar only strain. And that can have a characteristic time associated with it that is probably pretty similar to the solar only model, quite frankly. That's sort of how I've been thinking about that. And again, this is all stuff I'm working on now. So that's how I'm thinking of it at the moment.
Oh, that's fantastic. We've in the past we've tried some visualizations of it to essentially do kind of a state diagram and showing, based on the size of the nodes and the thickness of the arrows, how likely you are to end up in one state or another and that sort of thing.
Yeah, so that's what I tried to do here, where the thickness of the line indicates the probability of the progression from, for example, smart thermostat to HVAC. And then I overlaid this text, which gives, the actual probability, which in this case is 47.2% movement from smart thermostat to HVAC. So essentially conditional probability on arriving at smart thermostat. Whether this figure actually conveys that, I'm not 100% sold yet. I would love to see your, what I assume are slightly higher quality than mine figures.
Don't know about that. Okay, yeah, I can absolutely point you to them. Oh, sorry.
It's difficult, right? This is a ton of information. Edward Tufte would tell me, no, you go sit down. That's too much information. And I don't know how to display it the most attractive, most communicative way.
I don't know that it's too much information. I mean, that classic one of Napoleon's march to and from Russia, that had more more axes, so to speak, than that in there, and that's his go-to example. Let's see. Okay, there are some questions in here. Let's see. So using your framework, is it possible to model whether exposure to information about the ongoing adoption process changes the agent's behavior as they make these sequential choices?
Yes. And that's something that I'm playing with in this sequential decision-making model, which is to say, can I introduce some probabilistic idea about which technology is adopted first or which path somebody starts on first based on the nature of the last informational touch. From a modeling perspective, yeah, totally easy to do. And from survey, we have some ideas about what it should look like. That's actually that figure that I showed with the progressions through. That comes from survey data. So and I cannot overemphasize the importance of good survey data. When you want to know how agents behave, ask them. The survey data tells us what we should expect. For example, when somebody launches down a certain pathway, or who the last person they talked to was, or who was their sparking event for launching down a particular pathway. I hope that answers your question. I got a bit rambly.
I think it does. And as a follow-on to that, are you collecting sequential survey data or some other sequential data to try to validate the sequential process in the model?
Yeah, 100%. We have both from surveys and from administrative data. Now, it's a little harder to work things out from administrative data, but we have basically ideas about what the overall distribution of devices in the system should be. And then from asking people, we know how they progressed through.
Okay. There's also a comment here. Texas doesn't have an income tax, but does have high property tax. Is that an important component to the model, do you think? Or the dynamics, I guess.
So I can't think of off the top of my head a way that that would really play in, apart from maybe making, when your property tax comes due, for folks who don't put it in escrow, a sort of short-term depression on buying other stuff. I can't think of a way that that might show up. However, I will say that it's the dependence on property tax that fuels the tax assessor data, which gives us the property values for all of the single-family households who have the option to make this decision to adopt solar PV. So, in that it is, in that a very high-value data stream is related to property tax, it's very important. Someplace which did not have property taxes, for example, is unlikely to collect the same data. Though I can't think of any place that doesn't have property taxes off the top of my head.
Oh, that's an interesting point. Let's see, another question. Policy is usually issued within a given rationale, a way to think about the problem at hand. Is the model somehow linked to that rationale? If so, or if not, how do you actually relate the model to decision making?
So the rationale for a rebate, for example, is, you know, essentially to generate some social benefits. So we're going to make it easier, cheaper for folks to buy the thing which generates the social benefit, right? And this is, in a very sort of practical sense, why, for example, the California Solar Initiative distributed about $2 billion. They did it so that folks would buy residential solar PV. And so in that sense, I think that there's a very clear connection between policy, the rationalization for policy, and the implementation design, which was a rebate. The informational interventions are a little different. These are often undertaken by community organizations who are responding to their own desire to increase the social benefits, right? To move towards less emissions intensive grid. And they're doing it by trying to motivate their communities to make this decision, right? And this is where we see things like porch talks, things like phone ambassadors coming from. So I will say that the policy is not always at the public level that designs and implements the programs that are included in that sort of informational subsystem and economic subsystem model that I showed.
Fantastic. And another sort of semi-related follow-on to that. In the case of solar panels, does the availability of infrastructure play a role in the model, or is that assumed?
It's not modeled directly. And basically, I think, well, the direction I'm going to go in the answer, and forgive me for putting words in your mouth, the part of this question that I think is really interesting is the role of the installer. I have another project in which we're investigating ideas like this, but the idea might be, and I have work that shows some effect like this in the California market, where there is one market in which the state of adoption is relatively mature. We'll call this a mature market, which is adjacent to a less mature market. And it looks like it is the case that there's some pent-up demand in the immature market. And then when adoption becomes available in the immature market, which is to say that probably an installer expands into that market, there's a really high initial blip of adoptions. So really, I guess what I would say is incorporate the role of an installer or some sort of broker is extremely interesting, and I've not done this yet.
Yeah, that is actually, yeah, that's a dynamic I wouldn't necessarily have thought of ahead of time. Okay, we've got just a couple of minutes left. If folks have other questions, please put them in the chat. Otherwise, I'm going to start wrapping. Oops, hang on. Is there a consideration for the relative cost of solar compared with traditional fossil fuels? Oil and gas prices have skyrocketed lately. Also, the impression that maybe the traditional fossil fuel supply may not be reliable with hacks, etc.
Yeah, so the short answer is no, I didn't include the Colonial Pipeline. The way that individuals generate benefits in this model has to do with essentially how much how much sun they can collect, right? It does not explicitly consider how much fossil fuel generated energy they would otherwise have had to buy. There are features of deregulated market. So most of this modeling exists in regulated spaces or something very similar. Texas overall is deregulated, but Austin is immune. So everybody has the same alternative, which is to buy from Austin Energy. It does seem like there are ways in a different market structure that somebody could express their desire for green energy without putting solar panels on their roof. For example, by signing up for community solar or by just purchasing from a green retail energy provider. I have not modeled that, but it sounds like it could be pretty interesting.